The U.S. has a long history with regulation of abortion. The issue has been a hot-button topic for over 100 years. At the time of the Constitution, abortions before the quickening, or first signs of fetal movement, were commonplace. Then, beginning with Connecticut in 1821, abortion was outlawed. The Connecticut law specifically made it illegal to use toxic substances to bring on a miscarriage after the quickening, which was usually 4 or 5 months into pregnancy. By 1880, most states had instituted bans on abortion unless it was to save the life of the mother. The motivation behind these laws was trifold. First, they were included in a pushback against the movements of birth control and suffrage that were starting to gain traction. Another reason was that the male-dominated professional field of medicine wanted to take away power from midwives. These women were the ones who had dealt with reproductive health and abortion for generations, but doctors wanted to run them out of business. The American Medical Association claimed that they were against abortion because of its immorality and dangerousness, but realistically, abortion was no riskier than other surgeries during the 1800s. Importantly, childbirth was also very dangerous, so in some ways having an abortion avoided risks. Perhaps most importantly, these laws were created to drive up the birth rate of middle-class white women by removing the option of abortion. Lawmakers did not want immigrants, Catholics, and freed people to dominate the population, which they feared might happen if white women had access to abortions. By 1910, all but one state had banned abortion except to save the life of the mother, but this did not dampen the demand for abortions. Many so-called back alley abortions were performed, and women suffered from this. In Chicago, Cook County Hospital had an abortion ward that served 5,000 patients annually. The women in this ward were victims of botched abortions and were infected, bleeding, and sometimes dying. One group that formed to try to address the dangers of illegal abortions was the Jane Collective, founded in 1969. The collective was made up of mostly women from different backgrounds who were given basic, under-the-table medical training. From 1969 to 1973, the Janes performed 12,000 abortions. Then, in 1973, there was a major upheaval in abortion law with the passage of Roe v. Wade, which granted the right to have an abortion. The reasoning was that abortion fell under the right to privacy guaranteed in the 14th Amendment. Further restrictions were added in 1992 with the Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania v. Casey ruling. This case let states restrict pre-viability abortions as long as there was no, quote, undue burden put on the women seeking abortion services. Mandatory parental involvement, waiting periods, and biased counseling are all allowed under the law, although requiring spousal involvement is not. More recently, there have been a new wave of abortion restricting laws, many of which specifically target Roe. 7 states have so-called trigger laws, which would ban nearly all abortions if Roe were to be overturned, and another 7 have passed laws to limit abortion as strictly as is permitted. For example, Alabama's House Bill 314 reads, "The amendment made it clear that the Constitution of Alabama of 1901 does not include a right to abortion or the right to funding of abortions using public funds." Alabama has one of the strictest laws, which makes performing an abortion a felony and includes no exceptions for cases of rape or incest. Overall, 19 states have laws to limit abortion. Some of these are unenforced pre-Roe bans, and others have post-Roe bans or trigger laws, currently blocked by a court order. Also, 10 states have protected the right to an abortion if Roe were to be overturned. Now that we've covered the history of abortion policy in the U.S., let's look at how it has set the stage for these modern debates over Roe v. Wade. U.S. policy has set a standard of hiding under the guise of morality, not trusting women to make decisions about their bodies, and pushing back on Roe v. Wade as much as possible without actually overturning it. The argument against abortion is often justified by morality, but that starts to fall apart when it is closely examined. Back in the 1800s, when abortion was first outlawed in the U.S., as was said before, the American Medical Association said they were against abortion since it was morally bad and risky. However, the bigger reason is that this class of elite male physicians was trying to professionalize medicine and box out the midwives who had been dealing with reproductive health. One main service midwives provided was abortions. So by outlawing abortions, these physicians could eliminate midwives and thus have less competition and more opportunity to make money. This history of claiming morality when there are ulterior motives at play in the case of an abortion ban continues on today. Still, many people who are against abortion say it is due to moral reasons, since they believe life begins at conception, so they do not want to end life. However, there seems to be some contradicting ideology over this idea that life begins at conception. The Alabama abortion ban contains no exceptions for rape or incest, but does contain an exception for in vitro fertilization. When asked about it during an Alabama legislature debate, Alabama State Senator Clyde Chambliss replied, "The egg in the lab doesn't apply. It's not in a woman. She's not pregnant." How could the incredibly restrictive laws be intended to protect the fetus when there is no outrage over embryos being discarded in the IVF process? It's clear that this debate is not about morality, but rather about controlling women's bodies. As Chambliss said, the egg doesn't matter if it's not in a woman. Women's ability to make decisions about themselves has been doubted by the U.S. for an extended period of time. In the Griswold v. Connecticut Supreme Court ruling in 1965, it was determined that the Connecticut statute forbidding the use of contraceptives violates the right of marital privacy, which is within the penumbra of specific guarantees of the Bill of Rights. Though this was definitely a step forward in that birth control became accessible, it only applied to married women. It wasn't until 1972 in Baird v. Einstadt that birth control was legalized for all Americans, married or not. Women were not trusted to have access to birth control before marriage for years after oral contraceptives were introduced. The American government and courts didn't allow women to make family planning decisions without a husband for years. This echoes the current debates over whether a woman should be allowed to make the decision for herself to have an abortion. Finally, the U.S. has set the stage for current debates over Roe v. Wade through pushing back against the original ruling with more and more exceptions. The first big change to the ruling came in 1992 in Planned Parenthood v. Casey. This ruling stated, "Roe's rigid trimester framework is rejected. To promote the state's interest in potential life throughout pregnancy, the state may take measures to ensure that the woman's choice is informed. Measures designed to advance this interest should not be invalidated if their purpose is to persuade the woman to choose childbirth over abortion. These measures must not be an undue burden on the right." In the ruling, required parental involvement for minors, biased counseling, and waiting periods were upheld at any point in pregnancy. The only burden that was defined as, quote, undue, was forcing a woman to involve her spouse in the decision. This ruling pushed back on Roe, as did the Hyde Amendment, which was enacted in 1977 to prevent the use of federal funding on abortions, with exceptions for rape, incest, or a threat to the mother's life. These measures that quietly undo parts of Roe are mirrored with the new wave of abortion bills, including the Alabama one. Alabama Representative Terry Collins answered a question about the lack of exception for rape or incest in HB 314 with, "My goal with this bill, and I think all of our goal, is to have Roe v. Wade turned over and that decision be sent back to the states so that we can come up with our own laws that address and include amendments and things that address those issues." For decades, the U.S. has been working against Roe v. Wade directly. These actions have prolonged the debate over abortion, and this case specifically. Policies and court rulings are not the only things fueling the continued conflict over Roe v. Wade. There are societal factors at play too. One huge factor is the long-standing belief that pregnant women are a threat to their children. Maternal imagination was the once widely accepted concept that meant anything that left an impact on the woman would imprint on the fetus. This made it easy to blame the woman for anything that happened to her baby, and it still persists. PubMed has 20,000 articles on stress in pregnancy and only 651 on environmental toxins in pregnancy, though the latter is more dangerous. Flint saw a 58% increase in miscarriages after the lead water crisis, and Native Americans report 28% higher infant mortality rates and 50% higher birth defect rates than the national average, in part due to heavy metal contamination from abandoned mines. These are severe threats to fetuses, and yet so much more attention is put on the issue of how pregnant women might be harming them. In Georgia, under House Bill 481, a woman could be persecuted for second-degree murder if she is found to have caused a miscarriage through drug use, strenuous physical activity, or other activities. Women are still seen as threats to their babies, which contributes to the debate over abortion, since many people see the fetus as the victim, instead of seeing the woman as a person with the power to make decisions about their body. Another societal factor that continues the debate over abortion is protest. On January 22, 1973, the day of the Roe decision, there were anti-abortion protests held. One in Minnesota had 5,000 participants. A modern protest that is a clear continuation of this is the March for Life, an anti-abortion demonstration held every year on the anniversary of the ruling in Washington, D.C. Following the wave of abortion bans, there were nationwide protests to stop them. These demonstrations sent a message that the nation is still very divided on the topic of abortion, and Roe v. Wade specifically. The history of the United States in terms of abortion has set the stage clearly for continuing debates over Roe through legislation and court rulings that are easily disguised as morality, deny women the right to make decisions about their bodies, and push back against the original ruling. These debates have resulted in the creation of laws specifically to overturn Roe, which must not happen, since women deserve to make decisions about their own bodies.